Good morning, everyone. I don't really think this guy needs much of an introduction, except maybe to some of the people at Blackland Prairie and the new class, because Scott is probably one of our most dedicated volunteers. And to tell you the truth, we are so very fortunate to have him in our chapter. He is a retired geologist. He has an MS in environmental science. He has been a master naturalist since 2003, and he also transferred from the Gulf Coast chapter. Can't remember the exact year. I'm thinking it was around 2015, maybe. He's currently the project manager for Leela, which is probably one of the biggest project managers' jobs around with all the activity out there. And he's not only a project manager, he's very involved there in the greenhouse and working out on the restoration of the prairie. He also leads a monthly bird walk at Clear Creek. And he's the husband and patient. No, he is the husband and partner to the very patient Deborah. And he's been married for 44 years. And he's grandpa to, let me read all these names off: Hayden, Parker, Laura Lee, Annalise, and Arthur. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Scott.
Hello. All right. On to the real subject, which is the more important thing. This is one of the most interesting talks I've ever made, because corvids are one of the most interesting groups of birds on the planet. And we'll just get started off on the right foot here. Okay, go to. I always give credit where credit is due. And the range maps and all the images came from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in Ithaca, New York. I paid them exorbitant amounts of money, and they let me do this stuff. All right, let's talk about crows. The Corvidae are the largest of the passerines. Now, the passerines are the perching birds, which is pretty much all songbirds, and quite a few others that are not true songbirds. They have, as you can see, a worldwide distribution. And there are about 129 species or 131 species, depending on who you talk to, which is kind of normal with birds, particularly large groups of birds. They are medium to large size. They have certain things that are specific to all members of the crow family, which are crows, ravens, rooks, jackdaws, jays, magpies, treepies, choughs, and nutcrackers. Excuse me. They are all, oh, excuse me, sorry. That's the problem with reading your notes instead of just doing it from scratch. They all have strong feet and bills, which we'll talk about as time goes on. What are called rectal bristles, which are little hair-like bristles around the beak, which helps them catch things in the air occasionally. And unusually for songbirds, they molt only once a year. Most songbirds will go through 2 molts a year. They have a primary molt, and then they have a secondary molt, or the term is, I'm losing terms this morning, but they have, most songbirds have 2 notes. Crows are different in that they only have 1. In North America, there are 11 species of jays, including the Clark's nutcracker, 2 species of magpies, 4 species of crows, and 2 ravens. And a good many of those are also native to Texas. And we'll get around to talking about those as we go through the talk. Like most, if not all, highly social species, they display a remarkable cognitive ability, and they are amongst the most intelligent birds ever studied. And we will look at several videos that illustrate that. All right, once upon a time long ago, somewhere in Europe, the first crow was born, or at least the first crow evolved, depending on how you want to look at it. And he was Myocorvus larteti, 1871. It is the first real corvid fossil that everyone agrees is a crow. And you can see how few bones are actually there in that photograph, but they've decided that that is a crow. Probably the family originated sometime around 75 million years ago, and has since dispersed from their original location in Gondwana, which is the big southern continent at that time, and have dispersed, as you saw, all over the world. And there are all kinds of genetic analyses that we'll get into a little bit as we get on about talking about the relationships between the different groups in the crow family. All right, corvids and intelligence. We're going to have several slides on this. First thing to note is that the corvid brain, the bird brain in general, is layered. Think of it like a pizza. And all of the parts of a mammalian brain are here. They're just arranged differently. The interesting thing is that birds in general, and corvids in particular, have twice as many neurons per gram or centigram as mammals do. This probably has to do with trying to save weight for flying. Pretty much everything in a bird's life revolves around minimizing their weight. So one way to minimize your weight and still have a big brain is to concentrate a whole lot of neurons in a very tight little space, and they do that. So if you look at the diagram over here, you see the density and the size of the neurons, brain mass, and proportion of neurons in the forebrain. There are actually more neurons in a bird's forebrain than there are in a mammalian forebrain. So bird brain is not exactly what it traditionally means. And let's see. All right, this is something that we're going to talk about several times today. This is called acquired knowledge, and it is exactly what it sounds like. Things that you can learn.
A verdant park, an idyllic day. But something has gone terribly wrong. A passerby discovers it first and lets out a piercing call. Within seconds, everyone in earshot rushes to the scene. It's mayhem. Or so it seems. Crows are intelligent and super chatty. They watch out for one another within tight-knit groups. As adults, it's pretty rare for crows to be killed. So when one dies, the others notice. Are they just scared, or is something deeper going on? Kaylee Swift, a PhD candidate at the University of Washington, set up an experiment to find out. She visits a park in Seattle for a few days, leaving piles of peanuts for the crows. Then one day, Swift shows up looking very different. Wearing a mask and wig, she carries a dead, taxidermied crow. The first one that sees her sounds the alarm. The flock erupts in protest. The crows seem to wail and scold her and the dead bird. Swift calls these crow funerals, though they're not the solemn memorials we put on for our dead. She thinks these noisy gatherings are opportunities for crows to learn about the dangers that surround them within the safety of the group. When an unmasked Swift returns to the park the next week with more tasty peanuts, the crows are quiet and wary. They seem to have learned there's something hazardous about this place. Still, they eat the peanuts, but they take longer to approach and seem to be much more suspicious. And when Swift returns wearing the mask, they lose it. Even without the dead crow, they still see her as a threat. Compare that to these pigeons. They barely seem to register her holding their deceased comrade. That's how most creatures react. Just a few, like dolphins, elephants, and crows react strongly to seeing one of their own who's died. Even weeks later, the crows cause a ruckus when they see the mask. Some never even saw her with the dead crow, but they still learn to associate her with danger. It's called social learning, gaining new information by observing and imitating others. We're always looking to learn from one another too, to avoid the mistakes that led others to meet their untimely end.
This is another example of social learning, and this one's in here just because it's kind of fun. But I think this is another really good example.
Crows have always been a bit creepy. It probably doesn't help that a group of them is not so sweetly referred to as a murder, or that films such as Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds turn them into attempted murderers.
These are the eyes of the bird here, huge.
Professor John Marsloff studies urban birds at the University of Washington. He says forget the notion of dark and scary. Crows are friendly and smart.
I always call them flying monkeys. I think they're a very small flying monkey. Neurally, mentally, cognitively, they're a flying monkey.
So for the people who are creeped out by crows, you just really creep them out.
Yeah, sorry.
A crow's brain is the size of a human thumb, huge relative to its body, putting their intelligence on par with primates and allowing them to solve complex problems. The PBS series Nature showed an experiment where a crow figured out how to use a small stick to retrieve a larger stick and then use that to retrieve a piece of food that was well out of reach. Marsloff also conducts research with these masks. His team wears them on campus and then records what kind of sounds the crows make. They have discovered crows recognize and remember individual faces. By sedating the birds and putting them through a PET scan, they found different areas of a crow's brain light up when they see a person they perceive as friendly or threatening.
When crows see people, what can they do with that information?
Well, one, they recognize individual people that are important to them. And when somebody does something dangerous, they mark that person and remember that person, as far as I can tell, for their life.
These crows seem to remember 8-year-old Gabby Mann for a good reason. She and her mom, Lisa, feed them in their Seattle backyard.
They love dog food.
How smart do you think these crows are?
Very smart. They actually ran a test to see if a crow was as smart as a 7-year-old.
What did they find out?
It was.
Smart enough, it appears, to keep a good thing going.
This is a lot of stuff.
I know.
Gabby has a carefully cataloged collection of more than 70 trinkets her neighborhood crows have left on her bird feeder, including earrings, a heart, and a best friend charm.
What do you think they're telling you?
That I'm their friend.
Marsloff says more likely they are telling her to keep the food coming. He wrote an entire book called Gifts of the Crow. He says the behavior is part of a courtship with humans. Crows and their relatives, ravens and magpies, have been known to form close bonds with people. These are photos of a wild magpie that continually visits the same family which rescued and fed it.
So when the crows first started bringing gifts for you, what did you think about that?
I thought we should feed them more.
To get more gifts?
So much for having a bird brain.
So what do you got there?
A penny.
So the crows gave you money.
Yes.
That's a pretty good crow.
For CBS This Morning, Ben Tracy, Seattle.
Let's move on to actually talking about members of the family. All right, there are 9 subfamilies in Corvidae. The largest one is Corvus, which includes crows, ravens, rooks, and jackdaws. Then jays, magpies, of which there are a couple of different families, nutcrackers, treepies, who I'd never even heard of before I start this, and choughs. I know it says CHUF, but it's pronounced chuff. All right, ravens. First of all, there's no real consistent distinction between a crow and a raven. Much the same as there's no real good distinction between a dove or a pigeon. It's just a matter of size. Generally speaking, larger members of the genus are called ravens, and the next ones up the ladder down from there are called crows. The nine living ravens, the widest distribution is the common raven of the northern hemisphere, which you can see up here in the upper left corner of the slide. And the smallest is the forest raven of Tasmania, which inhabits these little tiny pieces of Australia. Ravens as a crew are not real colorful. They're all black, maybe a little gray here and there. Chihuahuan ravens have a little white ruff that you have to have the wind blowing the right direction to see. The closest thing we come to a colorful raven is the extinct pied raven of the Faroe Islands. And they were basically gray with a little bit of white, a brownish bill and a brownish bill. As a rule, ravens are less social than other members of the genus Corvus, gathering in small groups of 10 or less birds. However, there are reports of flocks as large as several hundred, but that appears to be a rare thing. In the wild, ravens are omnivorous, opportunistic feeders. Their diet is based on habitat and available food sources. They are really good carrion eaters. They're part of the crew that cleans up the North Woods. All right, just a bit of ID. How do you tell a crow from a raven? It's really fairly simple. Common ravens and American crows overlap throughout a lot of North America. If you look over here, you can see the range maps. This is the raven and this is the crow. So there's a lot of territory that they share. The differences are relatively straightforward. Ravens are a good deal larger, almost the size of a red-tailed hawk, and a crow is the size of a crow. If you look at the tail, when the tail is spread, you can see that a raven's tail forms more of a point, and a crow's tail is just a fan. That's because the crow tail feathers are all the same length, and the raven tail feathers are shorter on the outside and longer on the inside. So they form a slightly different looking spread when the tail is spread. The other obvious thing is to look at the neck of the bird. On a raven, they have a sort of a ruff that puffs out a little bit. Crows do not. It's very smooth. It's going to look like a single line from the throat, from the base of the mandible down onto the chest. But a raven will always have this sort of ruff down here. And you can always tell them apart by their calls. This is a raven. They croak. And everybody's familiar with a crow. In general, ravens are much less common than crows. In the Western United States, it's kind of a toss-up because you have Chihuahuan ravens and common ravens and fish crows. So in general, they're relatively easy to tell apart just based on size. But if you look at the two photographs of them flying, you can see the ruff in the neck, the heavier bill on the raven, and the spread tail. So with a little bit of practice, it's fairly easy to tell them apart. All right, crows, and more crows. There are 36 species of crows around the world, and they will all look very familiar. With one or two exceptions, the color palette is black, sometimes with a little gray accent, and in one or two cases, a little white. Some are very cosmopolitan, like the American crow and the hooded crow of Europe and the Middle East. Others are endemics, living on just a few island chains or only one island. There are several species that live on and around Papua New Guinea and Indonesia. These are two of the colorful ones, sort of. The piping crow and the gray crow at least have a little color. This fellow up here in the corner is the hooded crow. If you've ever been to Europe, these guys are all over the place. You'll also see carrion crows, which look very much like the North American crow. One more little bit of ingenuity, brought to you by Sir David Attenborough.
Crows have become highly skilled at making a living in these new urban environments. In this Japanese city, they have devised a way of eating a food that normally they can't manage. Dropping a nut from a great height onto a hard road does sometimes crack it, but some nuts are particularly tough. So the crows have devised a better way. Drop it among the traffic. Is collecting the bits without getting run over. So some birds have refined their technique. They station themselves beside pedestrian crossings. For the lights to stop the traffic. Then collect your cracked nut in safety.
I put that one in because I find it absolutely fascinating. That is not only just learning to use cars as a tool, it's figuring out how to take it one step further to lessen the risk of using the cars as a tool. All right, speaking crow. Recent research has begun to find out that crows caw is something like a human-inflected language where repetition or rapidity of the call or very small variations in pitch can change the meaning. The specifics of call differences are still being researched extensively, so far without the exact answers. Do crow dialects vary by region? Yes, they do. Crows in the west of the Cascades sound distinctly different. Their calls are harsher and much lower pitch than American crows in the rest of the country. That could be due to a long ago hybridization with northwestern crows who have a generally harsher sound to their calls and songs. So how many different sounds can a crow make? More than most people think, probably about 2 dozen to 3 dozen, depending on the crow. Loud caws do make up the bulk of their vocalizations, but their rattles, coos, growls, and other odd sounds. Particularly in the spring, if you have a family of crows living anywhere near you, you'll hear all sorts of gurgles and growls and coos, and that's parents talking to nestlings and then fledglings or to one another. There's quite a language here that's still in the very early stages of being deciphered. But as far as caws go, there are 2 basic types. There's, there's what's called a non-contextual call, which means they can't really be linked to any particular action or any particular event in and around the crows. It's just kind of, hey, I'm over here, where are you? And a good example of a companion call or a non-contextual call is this. And we're waiting for a reason. We'll get there. Those 3 or 4 caws with the short burst with the long wait in between, is because the crow is saying, I'm here, is anybody around? And that space is for the other crows to call back. So it's burst and silence, and can go on for several repetitions. When I first put this talk together for last year's annual meeting, I was sitting in the backyard and I heard one go on for about 10 minutes. 3 or 4 calls, then just a pause, 3 or 4 calls, and then just a pause. All right. That's a non-context vocalization. Context, excuse me, a companion call, a non-context vocalization. Now, context vocalization is about something that's going on. It can be, hey, I found a new source of food. It can be, look, there's a hawk in the tree. It can be, look, there's a cat on the ground. And they're quite different. This is basically mobbing. So even the caw, while it's just a single sound, can be used in different ways and to create information in a different context. Oh, let's go. All right, and this is our last little bit with crows. You remember John Marsloff, the professor they talked about early in the earlier slide? He was one of the people that first really noticed this.
This is BirdNote. Do crows have funerals? We asked author Tony Angel, who, with Professor John Marsloff of the University of Washington, wrote the book Gifts of the Crow: How Perception, Emotion, and Thought Allow Smart Birds to Behave Like Humans. Here's Tony.
A crow funeral is, in general, where the deceased bird is surrounded by members of the same species in significant numbers. At a crossroads, I watched a crow had been hit by a car, laid to rest there on one side of the street. Crows descended from the trees, and probably 100 crows in groups of maybe 8, 10, 12. They would walk around that individual that was on the ground, and then they would fly off. And over a 15, 20-minute period, eventually all the crows flew off, leaving that corpse of the crow in the road. Well, what's going on here seems to be a little more complicated than just paying homage. It's very likely that the crows are learning from this experience. Is there danger here? Is their territory now opened up with the death of this crow? Is there a mate available where before there wasn't? So all kinds of things are learned.
For more.
Okay. An interesting thing here that I'm going to throw in is that to us, crows all look the same. However, crows can see a ways into ultraviolet. And some recent research over the last 4 or 5 years has shown that probably crows can tell one another apart based on the fact that they see a wider range of visual information than we do.
This is.
Okay, rooks. These guys are all over Europe. The first time I saw one when we were on the infamous Viking cruise, he landed on the boat and sort of looked at me and said, "You're a birder, take a good look." And then he flew off. They have that white face. Otherwise, they're very much like a crow. There are 2 populations, and they're pretty much identical birds. They just live in different places. They're mainly resident birds. Only the northernmost populations may move south to avoid the harshest winter conditions. They're foragers on open lands and pastures. They tend to probe the ground looking for grubs and other soil-based invertebrates. But they'll eat cereals, plant material, and like all other corvids, if it's laying there and it looks edible, they will eat it. So rooks are extremely common in Europe, as well as the carrion crow and the hooded crow. All right, jackdaws. These are smaller members of the family. They're both shiny black. The Dorian jackdaw does have some gray on his body. Short, stout bills, because they're primarily opportunistic and highly adaptable, so they need a bill that they can use to go after just about any kind of food. They're not big probers like rooks are. They tend to take things as they find them. The principal difference in the plumage is this creamy white bit in the durian jackdaw. And you see right here in the center, there's just this tiny little bit of overlap. No one has ever seen a hybrid. They do not hybridize, even though the ranges overlap very slightly. Okay, moving on. Choughs. Choughs are mountain birds. They prefer higher elevations. Two varieties, the red-billed and the yellow-billed. The red-billed is by far the largest range. The yellow-billed is much more specified and really prefers higher elevations, as you can see from looking at the map. They're all black all the time. They're mountain specialists. Let's see, what else does it say? Occasionally you'll see choughs on the sea cliffs in Ireland and Great Britain and along the French coast. They typically breed above 4,000 feet, however, and in the Himalayas, their range reaches almost to 20,000 feet in the summer, and they have been recorded at 26,800 feet on Mount Everest. So they're interesting because of their habitat. They're this specialist in higher elevations. Okay, finally some color, the magpies. There are 14 different species of magpies around the world. They're all noisy, gregarious, just like the magpies found in North America. You can see that some of them have a very restricted range, but then the Eurasian magpie covers quite a territory. So again, it depends on which bird you're looking for. Their diet varies according to local habitats, basically invertebrates, small mammals, lizards, frogs, bird eggs, nestlings, and whatever else they can find. Although these guys are perfectly happy to eat berries and fruits, which is not necessarily a big part of the diet of most other corvids. Normally, they utilize the lowest airspace, flying between the trees with an undulating flight. You can see this if you get into West Texas and you bump into a magpie or you go to the Rocky Mountains. They float and then they'll pull their wings in and they'll drop and they'll fly again and then they'll float down and fly again and sort of make a sine wave as they fly through the air. They all have that nice long fancy tail. All right, this is one more. This is a big thing in animal studies, the concept of self-awareness. Generally, the only thing you can say for sure is that the animal is aware that they're looking in a mirror at themselves. What else is going on in their brain, we have no idea. And I look at myself in the morning and usually the first thought is, God, I'm getting old. I don't think that most birds feel that way, but they are able to recognize that it's them.
Humans aren't the only ones aware of their own reflection. Birds can recognize themselves as well. Researchers have shown this for the first time by placing different colored dots on magpies' necks. The birds could only catch a glimpse of the stickers if they looked in the mirror. Here you can see a bird scratch its neck when it notices a brightly colored sticker. Some magpies tried to remove the sticker with their beaks while others used their feet. Birds that were tagged with black spots that blended in with their feathers didn't react when they looked in the mirror. Magpies have bigger brains than other birds that allow for lots of connections between different brain areas. Researchers think this may explain why they can recognize themselves while other bird species may not be able to.
And here's the northern cardinal that attacked my oldest daughter's window on the side of her house. So the cardinal obviously thinks it's another cardinal and does not realize that she's looking at herself in the reflection. Treepies. Treepies are the most colorful members of the family. They're kind of their own little branch. They're vaguely related to magpies and vaguely related to jays, but they have their own little subfamily. There are 11 species. They look like magpies because they have long tails, but they're a little bit larger. And they use their tails for balance while they're flying. The collared treepie lives at higher elevations in the Himalayas. They also live in forests. They're highly arboreal, rarely come to the ground to feed. They are omnivorous, however, but there's very little information on their diets because they tend to live in places where it's rather inhospitable for people to come and research. That's also true of lesser yellowlegs and greater yellowlegs. They live in they breed in the muskeg in northern Canada, and no one likes to go up there because there's so many mosquitoes. And probably it's about the same here. They're usually encountered singly or in pairs. Occasionally, as family parties moving through the cover, they tend to hop through the hanging tangles in the canopy and gather food as they go along. Nutcrackers. There are 3 nutcrackers, one in North America. They are exactly what it says. They live on nuts. They have that huge, heavy bill that they use to crack it open. And so they're specialists in one particular kind of food, which may be good or maybe not, depending on the crop in any given year. I do not know about Eurasian nutcrackers or Kashmir nutcrackers. I do know that Clark's nutcrackers will migrate from higher elevations to lower elevations as the weather gets colder because there's more food at lower elevations. And jays, everybody's favorite bird, 49 colorful, noisy, gregarious corvids. They're all omnivores. They live in an area with at least some forest cover, although ground jays of Central Asia live in the high deserts of the Gobi. They're all social and very communicative. Jays are another one that one of these days I'm going to do a talk on jay conversation because it's fascinating to listen to and read about. Many of the more colorful New World species are found in small areas in Mexico, Central America, and South America. That's these fellows down here at the bottom with the big tails. All right, let's talk about our own corvids. There are some jays, an occasional nutcracker, an occasional magpie, some ravens, and a couple of crows. The uncommon jays of Texas. Pinyon jays were formerly regular winter visitors in the Trans-Pecos, but they haven't been reliably reported much since the early 2000s. So they're still around, but they're not as common as they once were, and no one quite knows why. They are highly social, cooperative breeders. They live in foothills and lower slopes of the western United States, northern Baja California, and Mexico. Although they are omnivorous, they are primarily interested in seeds, particularly from pinyon pines, hence the name. They have an expandable esophagus and long, strong wings, which allows them to cover territory and carry a lot of food. And they also cache, like most jays, crows, and other corvids, they'll cache food, and they can hide as many as 1,000 things in 1,000 different places, and approximately 80% of those get recovered. And here's a pinyon jay. Okay, the brown jay, the one in the center, the one on the far side, pardon me, was an uncommon but regular resident in Starr and Zapata counties through the 90s, but by 2006, there was no longer a year-round presence in the state. Since 2007, there have only been 5 documented sightings in Texas. Brown jays prefer lowland, disturbed forest and edge habitats, generally avoiding forest interiors. As a result, many populations are increasing due to deforestation, which increases open areas and edge habitat, but not apparently in the United States just yet. Brown jays are extremely aggressive and have been observed fending off, even attacking large predators. They travel in small family groups and flocks of 1 or 2 breeding pairs, as well as non-breeding immatures. They're highly social, cooperative breeders, and the helper birds are key to the reproduction of the success of the brown jay as a group. Oh, stop you. Stop it. Thank you. And last, and down here in the corner is the Mexican jay. Mexican jays are residents of the Choughs Mountains, but there have only been 2 accepted sightings that occurred outside of Big Bend National Park. So next time you go to Big Bend, look for Mexican jays. It was formerly known as the gray-breasted jay. It inhabits oak, pine, juniper woodlands in the mountains of central and northern Mexico, as far north as mountain islets, the Sky Islands of southern Arizona and New Mexico, and in western Texas. Again, these are highly social birds. They're cooperative breeders. They defend permanent territories with anywhere from 5 to 25 individuals making a group that has a definite social organization. Within each territory, 1 to 4 females breed simultaneously and somewhat monogamously, and the young are fed as a group. They're sort of kept more or less together. And here's what they sound like. Okay. A brand new bird, Woodhouse's scrub jay. It was actually known as the western scrub jay until a few years ago when, actually 2016, when them who figure these things out decided that the western jay was a little bit different. The California scrub jay is a little bit different from the Woodhouse's scrub jay. And you can see the territory of Woodhouse's here. The California scrub jay is this big patch off to the west down in the Baja California. They do live in 2 very different habitats. Oak woodlands and montane pinyon pine stand. Woodhouse's scrub jays live mainly among the pinyon pines. They developed relatively thin pointed bills that are adept at getting the pine nuts hidden between the pine cone scales. California scrub jays live around oak trees and have developed a stouter, more hooked bill that helps them hammer open acorns. Okay, moving on. Green jays. If you've ever been to the valley, you've seen and heard a green jay. They're everywhere and they are immensely noisy. They're lots of fun. Like other jays, they travel around in huge groups, usually anywhere from 15 to 25 or 30 birds. They'll breed cooperatively again. The breeding pair will have the current year's nestlings and 1 or 2 non-breeding jays from the previous year. The 1-year-olds defend territory while the parents are able to see to the chicks and gather food. To point out that how they eat is to pry up bark and expose insects, that they are almost exclusively insect eaters. And they're amongst the few North American bird species known to use tools. I don't have an example of that. And here's our resident western jay. If you've ever been to the Rockies, this is another one like the green jay. You've heard and seen Steller's jays. And it's not because they're stellar looking birds. They're named after an explorer whose last name was Steller. And they stick to the high country. And they also stick to the tops of the trees by and large. We spent a couple of weeks at Lake Tahoe a few years ago, and there were 2 or 3 of them that lived in the tops of the pine trees right around the house we were renting. And they never, ever are quiet. They're always yakking about something. What else? Named after George Steller, a naturalist on a Russian explorer ship. They are habitual nest robbers, like many other jay species. They occasionally have been seen attacking and killing small adult birds, including pygmy nuthatches and dark-eyed juncos. They are also, like most jays, excellent mimics with a large repertoire of different songs and calls. And our familiar blue jay. I grew up calling these guys the Sentinels of the woods because they're always watching and waiting to see what's going on and making noise about it. They're an almost unmistakable bird. Blue on top, crest, black necklace, and white underneath. Thousands of blue jays migrate in flocks along the Great Lakes and the Atlantic coast, but much about their migration is still a mystery. We really haven't studied them enough to know if they're separate groups that migrate, or do they always migrate to the same place? Will they disperse? What conditions do they disperse under? If they disperse, is it wide, or is it always a narrow, same groups going to the same place all the time? So anybody who wants to go back and do a PhD studying jays, there's lots to be done. Jays are known to take and eat eggs and nestlings of other birds. It's not common, but it does happen. Most of their diet is composed of insects and nuts. Blue jays frequently mimic the calls of hawks. Most of us have heard a blue jay mimic a red-shouldered hawk. They do a really excellent job of it. And at least there's one in my neighborhood who does a pretty decent imitation of a Cooper's hawk, which he has used on more than one occasion to get birds out of the feeder so that he can sail in and just eat in peace and quiet without having to argue with anybody else. So they'll use those mimic calls of predators, sometimes to warn other birds that there could be a predator in the neighborhood, and sometimes just so that they can get everybody out and have an easier time to get into a feeder. The pigment in blue feathers of all birds, just to throw in a side note, is what's called structural color. There are tiny little bubbles in the keratin of the keratin that makes the feathers, and those bubbles reflect light, and the reflected light comes back and we see it as blue. If you look at a blue jay's feather in a dark room or a darker room where there's not a lot of reflected light, you'll notice that they look almost brown. And everybody knows blue jay, so I don't have their color. All right, black-billed magpie. This is a TBRC review species, which means basically it's been seen in the state, but it's been seen less than a certain number of times. And it has to be carefully documented in order for people to actually count it. So black-billed magpies have been seen in the state, but they've only been reliably reported in about 4 different spots. Black-billed magpies make really huge nests that take up to 40 days to construct. And they only use about 1% of the daily energy expenditure. Let's see, study found that he used only about 1% of the daily energy expenditure of the pair to make this giant nest. So they must do it because it's relatively easy. Laying eggs, on the other hand, takes 20% of the female's daily energy budget just to get the eggs laid, let alone to feed them and so forth. Historical records in the American West indicate that black-billed magpies have been associated with people for a very long time. Magpies frequently follow hunting parties of Plains Indians and fed on the leftovers from bison kills. Lewis and Clark reported magpies entering their tents and stealing food. Like most members of the jay family, The corvids in general, magpies are nest predators. Other than that, they are the standard corvid omnivore. If they can figure out it, get a hold of it, and if it looks like food, they will eat it. All right, we have 3 crows in the state of Texas. The American crow, the most common, you can see up here in the corner. The fish crow, which you can really only see in East Texas. You've got to get to the piney woods before you start to regularly see fish crows. And they sound sort of like American crow with a nasal condition. And they don't necessarily hang only around water, but they're much more common around water because fish are a big part of their diets. And lastly, down at the very end of the Texas Valley is the Tamaulipas crow. Almost raven-like. As far as telling them apart visually, it's exceptionally difficult to do. They're all practically identical, along with the northwestern crow of the Pacific coast. There are very minor differences, but until you get really good at field identification, you really have to hear one of them calling before you have a definite idea, or you really have to know where you are and know that one kind of crow or the other is not going to be where you are, so you can eliminate those. All right, one last cool crow video. This is a little long. It's going to get us past our hour, but it's really neat.
All right, can I stay in here?
Absolutely, you can sit and watch.
Right.
We'll see what happens.
Come on then, send in your mastermind because it's going to need that.
Alex studies wild birds, which he releases after 3 months of research. This one is nicknamed 007, and it's about to attempt what Alex believes is one of the most complex tests of the animal mind ever constructed. The bird is familiar with the individual objects, but this is the first time he's seen them arranged like this. 8 separate stages that must be completed in a specific order if the puzzle is to be solved. And if the bird succeeds, it'll be a world first. He takes time to have a look and then starts with the short stick. Stage 1. He finds it's too short to reach the food. He then sets off to get the first stone. But he drops it. And another. He seems to be stuck. But then, something seems to click. He deploys the first stone. And then another. 8th and final stage. Success. 8 individual stages of one complex puzzle completed.
I think they made it clear at the beginning of that no one trained the crow to do that. He figured out each one of those steps on his own, and then they were all set out, and he had to figure out the order in which to do them to get what he needed. And last but not least, the 2 Texas ravens. The common raven, which is native to West Texas, in a small spike out here, and the Chihuahuan raven, which is native to a larger portion of the state. If you look up here in the corner, if I make the clock go away, you can see the Chihuahuan raven has that white ruff underneath his neck feathers. And the only way to see it is to have the bird in the right direction so the wind blows the feathers apart. They do sound pretty much the same. Okay. So that is a very swift, that is a very swift run through of the corvid family with a little bit of emphasis on the ones that we can see here in the state of Texas. And as always, at the end of my talks, happy birding, everybody.
Well, Scott, I don't see any questions except for one from Carter. What do you call 2 ravens stuck together?
I'm not even going to guess. Oh, well.
Oh, well.
Anyway, thank you all for your time. And again, I wish we had been able to do this in person. I miss every one of you immensely. I'm really ready for all of this nonsense to be over with. And unfortunately, we're a long way from there, apparently. I look forward to seeing everybody who shows up at the annual meeting. I'll be doing a presentation on the kingfisher family, somewhat similar to the one I just did on the corvid family. And if you got some spare time, remember, you can always come out and volunteer at Lila. Thank you.
All right then, Scott, thank you very much. That was a very good presentation, very informative. Learned a lot. I never have thought that much about corvids or crows, really, to tell you.
It fascinated me when I first started this to discover how many different ones there are. And the fact that they basically break into 2 groups. There's one group that's colorful and one group that's just black and white. And there's no real overlap there. It's just interesting.
Yeah, that last test, I don't know if I could have passed it or not in the right order. Yeah. All right, then, good deal. I think we had over 120 participants today, so that is a very good representation, so very good. So having said that, the meeting is over. I don't see anything else. Thanks to everybody that participated, either presenter or just being a listener. So thank you very much. Bye.